She was running from a forced wedding to the most dangerous outlaw in the Dakota Territory when a Lakota warrior offered her his Tipi and his protection. "I'd rather be scalped by Indians than be that devil's wife," Clara Whitmore whispered into the prairie wind, not knowing that salvation would come from the very people she'd been taught to fear. The wedding dress hung in Clara Whitmore's bedroom like a burial shroud, its ivory silk catching the harsh morning light that streamed through the cabin's single window. She stared at it with the kind of revulsion most people reserved for poisonous snakes, her stomach churning as she counted the hours until she would be forced to wear it. 12 hours. In 12 hours, she would become Mrs. Jake Blackjack Morrison, wife to the most feared outlaw leader in the Dakota Territory.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
A man who collected scalps like other men collected coins, who had burned 3 towns to the ground in the past year alone, who looked at her with the cold hunger of a wolf. Gara pressed her face against the cool glass of the window, watching the preparations unfold in the dusty yard below. Men with guns strapped to their hips carried wooden benches from the barn, setting them in rows before a makeshift altar her father had constructed from old fence posts. These weren't wedding guests, they were Morrison's gang, the Devil's Dozen. Each one wanted by the law and feared by every decent person from here to California. Her father, Samuel Whitmore, stood in the center of it all, his face gray with shame but his jaw set with determination. He barked orders at the men, trying to maintain some semblance of authority even though everyone present knew the truth. He was no longer the master of his own land. He was a debtor paying his dues with his daughter's body and soul. The gambling debts had started small, Clara knew. A few dollars lost at poker in Deadwood, then a few more. But Samuel Whitmore had never known when to fold, and Blackjack Morrison had been patient, letting the debt grow like a cancer until it consumed everything the family owned. The ranch, the cattle, the mining claim up in the Black Hills, all of it now belonged to Morrison, and the final payment, the interest on 3 years of accumulated losses, was Clara herself. 23 years old and still unmarried. Morrison had said when he'd come to collect, his black eyes roaming over Clara's body like she was livestock at auction. Perfect age for breaking in. Not too young to be trouble, not too old to be set in her ways. Clara's mother, Margaret, had wept silently in the corner during that conversation, her hands twisted in her apron. She'd stopped speaking to Clara altogether after Morrison left, as if avoiding her daughter's eyes could somehow make the inevitable disappear. A knock at the bedroom door interrupted Clara's dark thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting to see her mother with breakfast she wouldn't be able to eat. Instead, Blackjack Morrison himself stepped into the room, filling the doorway with his imposing frame. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and thick through the chest, with black hair that hung past his collar and a beard that couldn't quite hide the scar running from his left ear to the corner of his mouth. He wore his usual black duster over dark pants and boots, and the ivory handles of his twin Colt revolvers gleamed at his hips. "Grooms not supposed to see the bride before the wedding," Clara said, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the fear that clawed at her throat. Laugh was like gravel in a whiskey barrel. "Reckon I'll make my own rules about that, sugar." He stepped further into the room, his spurs jingling softly against the wooden floor. "Besides, wanted to bring you a little wedding present." He reached into his coat and pulled out a necklace choker made of what looked like small bones and dark beads strung together with sinew. Clara's blood turned cold as she realized what she was looking at. Sioux finger bones, Morrison said with obvious pride. Took M off a war party we encountered up near the Rosebud. Thought my bride should wear something that shows she belongs to a man who takes what he wants. Clara backed away until her shoulders hit the wall. I won't wear that. Oh, you will. Morrison's voice dropped to a purr that was somehow more terrifying than a shout. You'll wear it today, and you'll wear it every day after. Reminder of what happens to folks who cross me. He advanced slowly, the necklace dangling from his fingers like a snake. Clara pressed herself harder against the wall, her mind racing. For some escape, some way out of this nightmare. But there was nowhere to run. Morrison's men surrounded the house, and even if she could somehow get past them, where would she go? The nearest town was 40 miles away across open prairie, and a woman alone wouldn't last a day in that wilderness. Please, she whispered, hating herself for begging but unable to stop the word from escaping. Morrison's scarred face split in two. A grin. I do so enjoy it when they're polite. He reached out to fasten the necklace around her throat, his fingers rough against her skin. The bones felt like ice against Clara's neck. Each small piece a reminder of a life Morrison had taken. A person reduced to decoration for his amusement. She closed her eyes and tried to transport herself somewhere else. Anywhere else, but Morrison's presence was too overwhelming. His scent of leather and gunpowder and something darker filling her nostrils. There, he said, stepping back to admire. His handiwork, pretty as a picture. Course, you'll be even prettier tonight, when I, Jake. Samuel Whitmore's voice called from downstairs, sharp with urgency. Jake, you need to come quick. Morrison's eyes narrowed with annoyance. What now? He turned back to Clara, his gaze lingering on the obscene necklace. Don't you go anywhere, sugar. We got us a wedding to attend. After he left, Clara collapsed onto her narrow bed, her whole body shaking. She reached up to touch the necklace, then jerked her hand away as if the bones had burned her. This was her future to be Morrison's property, his trophy, wearing the remains of his victims like jewelry. She could hear voices from downstairs, tense and urgent. Morrison was cursing about something, and she caught fragments of conversation. ... Cavalry patrol ... Spotted our smoke ... How many men? Clara crept to the window and peered out. In the distance, perhaps 2 miles away, she could see a thin line of blue uniforms moving across the prairie. A cavalry patrol, probably out of Fort Robinson, riding hard toward the ranch. Morrison and his men were already saddling their horses, the wedding forgotten in the face of more immediate concerns. The outlaw leader's voice carried clearly across. The yard will be back tomorrow night. Keep the girl locked up tight, Samuel. I mean to collect what's mine. Within minutes, the devil's dozen were thundering away from the ranch, leaving only dust and the acrid smell of gunpowder in their wake. The cavalry patrol would find nothing but a struggling rancher and his family when they arrived. Clara watched the dust cloud fade into the distance, her mind working frantically. Tomorrow night, Morrison would be back tomorrow night to claim his bride. That gave her perhaps 24 hours to find some way out of this hell. She went to her small wooden chest and pulled out the few belongings that truly mattered to her. Her grandmother's silver locket, a photograph of her family from better times, and the small leather journal where she'd been recording her thoughts and dreams since she was 12 years old. Everything else the dresses her mother had sewn.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
The books she'd read by candlelight, The life she'd built in this room would have to be left behind at the bottom of the chest. Wrapped in an old petticoat was the one thing that might save her life, her grandfather's Navy Colt revolver, a relic from the Mexican War that he'd taught her to shoot when she was 15. Samuel had forgotten about it after the old man died, assuming it had been lost or sold like everything else of value. Clara checked the cylinder still, loaded just as she'd left it. 6 shots. If she was careful, if she was smart, if she was lucky, it might be enough. The cavalry patrol arrived an hour later, their horses lathered with sweat from the hard ride. The lieutenant in charge was young, probably not much older than Clara herself, with fair hair and earnest blue eyes that reminded her of her brother Thomas before he'd died of fever 3 years ago. "Ma'am," the lieutenant said, touching his hat as Clara emerged from the house. "Lieutenant William Hayes, United States Cavalry. We're pursuing a group of armed men who were reported in this area." "Haven't seen anybody like that," Samuel Whitmore lied smoothly. "Just us peaceful ranchers, trying to make an honest living." Clara opened her mouth to contradict him, to tell this young soldier everything, to beg for protection. But the words died in her throat as she saw her father's warning look, the slight shake of his head that reminded her of Morrison's parting threat. The outlaw had made it clear what would happen to anyone who betrayed her man. That included her family. "Well, if you do see anything suspicious," Lieutenant Hayes continued, "there's a reward posted. $500 for information leading to the capture of Jake Morrison." $500. More money than Clara's family had seen in years. But it might as well have been 5,000 or 5 million. It was blood money, and Morrison would kill anyone who tried to claim it. After the patrol left, Clara helped her mother prepare dinner in silence. Margaret Whitmore moved like a ghost. Through the familiar motions of cooking, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. She'd cried all her tears already. "Mama," Clara said quietly as they peeled potatoes together, "there has to be another way." Margaret's knife paused for a moment, then resumed its methodical work. "There is no other way, Clara. Your father owes more than we could ever repay. At least this way, the ranch stays in the family. At least we survive. What about me? Do I survive?" Margaret's hands began to shake, and she set down the knife. "You'll learn to survive. Women always do. We adapt, we endure, we make the best of whatever life gives us." But Clara had no intention of adapting to life as Black Jack Morrison's wife. That night, as her parents slept the exhausted sleep of people who had given up hope, she made her preparations. She dressed in her brother's old clothes, pants and shirt and boots that would be easier to move in than skirts and petticoats. She braided her long brown hair and tucked it up under Thomas's hat, hoping the disguise might buy her a few extra seconds if she encountered anyone on the trail. The revolver went into a holster that had also belonged to Thomas, along with the spare ammunition he'd left behind. She packed lightsome bread and dried meat, a water bottle, and the few precious items from her chest. Everything else would have to stay. Just before dawn, as the first pale light began to creep across the eastern horizon, Clara slipped out of the house and made her way to the barn. Her horse, a sturdy little mare named Ginger, nickered softly as Clara saddled her in the darkness. She led the horse away from the house before mounting, not wanting the sound of hooves to wake her parents. There would be hell to pay when Morrison returned and found her gone, but by then she intended to be far away from this place of broken dreams and shattered hopes. The problem was, she had no idea where to go. The nearest town was Deadwood, but Morrison had allies there, Fort Robinson was even farther, and she wasn't sure the cavalry would protect a rancher's daughter from her legal obligations. Even if those obligations were to an outlaw, Clara pointed. Ginger north, toward the Badlands, where the broken landscape might hide her trail. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was better than standing still and waiting for Morrison to claim his prize. As the sun rose higher, painting the endless grassland in shades of gold and green, Clara rode harder than she'd ever ridden in her life. Behind her lay everything she'd ever known, her family, her home, her identity as Samuel Whitmore's daughter. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and quite possibly death. But for the first time in months, Clara Whitmore was free, and she intended to stay that way, no matter what it cost her. The prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, vast and indifferent to human suffering. Somewhere out there were answers, sanctuary, a chance at a life that wasn't defined by other people's debts and decisions. All she had to do was survive long enough to find it. The morning wind carried the scent of wild grass and distant storms, and Clara rode toward an uncertain future with nothing but hope and determination to guide her way. By midday, the sun beat down mercilessly on the open prairie, and Clara's water was running dangerously low. She'd pushed Ginger hard through the morning hours, driven by the certainty that Morrison would discover her absence soon and come after her with the fury of a man who'd been robbed of his prize. The landscape around her had begun to change, the rolling grassland giving way to more broken terrain, rocky outcrops, and deep ravines that spoke of ancient geological violence. This was the edge of the Badlands, a maze of eroded stone and hidden canyons that stretched for hundreds of miles. Across the Dakota Territory, Clara had heard stories about this place from the old-timers, who sometimes stopped at her father's ranch. They spoke of it with a mixture of fear and awe, land where a man could disappear forever, where outlaws and renegades made their hideouts, where the Sioux still roamed free despite the government's efforts to confine them to reservations. It was also a place where a young woman traveling alone could die in a dozen different ways before sunset. Clara's hands were raw from gripping the reins. Her back ached from hours in the saddle, and her throat felt like sandpaper. But she pressed on, following what looked like an old game trail that wound between the increasingly dramatic rock formations. It was then that she heard the sound that made her blood freeze, the distant thunder of hoofbeats coming fast from the south. Multiple horses, riding hard, getting closer by the minute. Morrison had found her trail. Clara kicked Ginger into a gallop, racing toward a cluster of tall stone pillars that might offer some concealment. The mare responded gamely despite her exhaustion, her hooves striking sparks from the rocky ground as they plunged deeper into the Badlands. The hoofbeats behind them grew louder, and Clara could hear voices, now rough men shouting to each other. As they closed the distance, she recognized Morrison's voice above the others, roaring orders with the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. Fan out. She can't have gone far. And remember, want her alive and unmarked. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs as she guided Ginger through a narrow passage between two towering rock walls. The space was barely wide enough for horse and rider, and for a terrifying moment she thought they might become trapped. But then the passage opened into a small circular clearing surrounded by high stone walls, a box canyon. A dead-end. Clara dismounted quickly, her legs shaking from fear and exhaustion. There was nowhere left to run, nowhere to hide. This was where she would make her stand. She drew her grandfather's revolver, checking the cylinder one more time. 6 shots against however many men Morrison had brought with him. The odds were impossible, but Clara had no intention of going back to that ivory wedding dress and the life of horror it represented. The sound of horses entering the narrow passage echoed off the stone walls like thunder. Clara positioned herself behind a fallen boulder, using it as cover while she waited for her pursuers to emerge into the clearing. Black Jack Morrison was the first to appear, his black stallion picking its way carefully through the rocky debris. His scarred face was twisted with rage, and the twin colts at his hips gleamed in the afternoon sunlight. Behind him came 3 of his men. Clara recognized them from the ranch. There was Scar Thompson, a thin, weasel-faced man with a knife scar running across his forehead. Big Jim Hawkins, a mountain of a man with hands like ham hocks and a laugh that sounded like grinding stone. And worst of all, Snake Eyes Martinez, a half-Mexican gunfighter who was said to be faster with a pistol than any man in the territory. 4 against 1. Clara steadied her breathing and sighted down the barrel of her grandfather's gun, aiming for Morrison's chest. If she was going to die in this canyon, she'd take the devil himself with her. Clara. Morrison's voice boomed across the clearing. Clara, darling, I know you're here. Come out now, and we'll forget all about this little adventure. But if you make me come looking for you. He let the threat hang in the air, and Clara heard one of his men chuckle at whatever unspoken violence was implied. I got all day, sugar, Morrison continued, his voice taking on a false sweetness that was somehow more menacing than his anger. But my boys here, they're getting mighty restless. And when men get restless, sometimes they do things they shouldn't. Things that might damage the merchandise. Clara's finger tightened on the trigger. Just a little more pressure, and Morrison would be dead. But she knew that killing him wouldn't save her. His men would hunt her down and make her death far worse than anything Morrison himself had planned. Tell you what, Morrison said, dismounting from his stallion with casual grace. You come out right now, and I'll make sure the wedding happens proper like. Preacher, flowers, the whole celebration. But if you keep hiding like a scared rabbit, he drew one of his Colts and fired a shot into the air, the sound echoing like thunder off the canyon walls. Well, then I might just decide you need some taming before you're fit to be a wife. Clara closed her eyes, said a quick prayer to whatever God might be listening in this godforsaken place, and stepped out from behind the boulder with her gun raised. I'm here, Morrison, she said, her voice steadier than she'd dared hope, but I'm not going back with you. Morrison's grin was like a wolf baring its teeth. Oh, but you are, sugar. Question is whether you go back in one piece or several. The standoff stretched taut between them. 4 armed men against one desperate woman in a stone amphitheater carved by wind and time. Clara could see her death in Morrison's eyes, could almost feel the bullet that would end her defiance. And then, from somewhere high above, on the canyon rim, came a sound that changed everything. The wild, ululating war cry of a Lakota warrior. Head snapped up, his eyes scanning the rocky heights. What the hell? An arrow sprouted from Scar Thompson's shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing to the ground. A second arrow took Big Jim in the thigh, and the giant man's roar of pain and surprise echoed off the canyon walls. Indians. Snake Eyes Martinez shouted, drawing his gun and firing wildly at the canyon rim. We're under attack. Morrison's attention was torn between Clara and this new threat, his head swiveling as he tried to locate their attackers. That moment of distraction was all Clara needed. She fired. The shot took Morrison in the left shoulder, spinning him around and causing him to drop one of his guns. he cursed viciously, clutching the wound as blood seeped between his fingers. More arrows rained down from above, precisely aimed shots that spoke of hunters who could put a shaft through a running deer at 100 yards. Snake Eyes took one. Through his gun hand, his pistol clattering across the rocks as he screamed in pain and fury. Fall back. Morrison roared, using his good arm to help his wounded men retreat. Toward the narrow passage. Fall back, now, as the outlaws scrambled. For the dubious safety of the canyon entrance, Clara looked up at the rim high above her. For just a moment, she glimpsed a figure silhouetted against the bright sky, tall, broad-shouldered, with long black hair flowing in the wind and a bow held ready in strong hands. Then he was gone, vanished as silently as he had appeared. The echo of hoofbeats faded as Morrison and his surviving men fled the canyon, carrying their wounded with them. Clara stood alone in the sudden silence, her grandfather's gun still smoking in her trembling hand. She had been saved, but by whom? And more importantly, what did her mysterious rescuer want in return? The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the stone walls of the canyon in shades of gold and crimson. Soon it would be dark, and Clara had no idea what other dangers the night might bring. But for now, for this moment, she was alive and free. And that was more than she'd dared hope for when she'd first seen Morrison's dust cloud on the southern horizon. She looked up at the canyon rim once more, wondering if her rescuer was still watching, still protecting her from the shadows. The wind whistled through the stone formations, carrying with it the promise of mysteries yet to be revealed. Clara Whitmore had escaped the Devil's Wedding, but her real adventure was just beginning. Clara's hands shook as she holstered her grandfather's revolver, the acrid smell of gunpowder still sharp in her nostrils. The canyon had fallen silent except for the whisper of wind through stone and the nervous snorting of Ginger, who stood pressed against the far wall with her ears laid back in fear. The mysterious archer had vanished as suddenly as he'd appeared, leaving behind only the arrows embedded in the rocky ground where Morrison's men had fallen. Clara approached one of the shafts cautiously, her heart still hammering from the confrontation. The arrow was unlike anything she'd seen before carved. From dark wood and fletched with eagle feathers, the iron point sharp enough to punch through bone. Lakota craftsmanship. Clara had heard enough stories from traders and soldiers to recognize the distinctive style. But what was a Lakota warrior doing this far south? And why had he intervened to save a white woman he'd never met? The sun was sinking lower, painting the canyon walls in shades of amber and crimson. Soon it would be full dark, and Clara knew she couldn't stay here. Morrison might return with more men, or there could be other dangers lurking in the Badlands wolves, mountain lions, or worse. She needed shelter, water, and time to think about her next move. As she turned to gather Ginger's reins, a shadow fell across the canyon floor. Clara looked up to see a rope descending from the rim high above, followed by the fluid motion of a man rappelling down the sheer rock face with the casual ease of someone born to such heights. Her hand moved instinctively to her gun, then stopped, as she got her first clear look at her rescuer. He was Lakota, as she'd suspected, tall and lean with the kind of natural grace that spoke of a life lived in harmony with wild places. His long black hair was braided with strips of leather and small bones, and his face was painted with simple geometric patterns in white and red clay. He wore buckskin leggings and a sleeveless shirt that revealed arms corded with muscle, and a bone choker adorned his throat. But it was his eyes that made Clara's breath catch dark as midnight and filled with an intelligence that seemed to see straight through to her soul. There was no hostility in his gaze, but there was wariness. The careful assessment of a predator deciding whether she represented threat or prey. The warrior reached the canyon floor and released the rope, moving with the same silent fluidity that had allowed him to appear and disappear like smoke. He said nothing, but his eyes took in every detail: Clara's boy's clothing, the gun at her hip, the exhaustion and fear written across her features. "Thank you," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You saved my life." The warrior tilted, his head slightly, studying her face as if trying to read the words she hadn't spoken. When he finally spoke, it was in accented but clear English, his voice deep and resonant in the confines of the canyon. "You run from the one they call Black." "Jack," he said. It wasn't a question. Clara nodded, wondering how much this stranger knew about Morrison and his reputation. "He wants to make me his wife. My father owes him money, and I'm the payment." Something flickered in the warrior's dark eyes, understanding, perhaps, or recognition of a familiar injustice. "And you choose death over such a marriage?" "I choose freedom," Clara replied with more conviction than she felt. "Whatever the cost." The warrior was quiet for a long moment, his gaze never leaving her face. Then he moved to examine the arrows he'd shot, pulling them from the ground with practiced efficiency and checking them for damage before returning them to the quiver slung across his back. "Morrison will return," he said without looking at her. "More men, more guns. This place is a trap for you now." Clara's heart sank. She'd known it was true, but hearing it spoken aloud made the reality inescapable. "Then I'll keep running. Where?" The warrior straightened and fixed her with that penetrating stare. "The nearest town is controlled by Morrison's allies. The army fort is 3 days' ride through hostile territory. You have no supplies, no knowledge of the land, no allies to call upon." Each word hit Clara like a physical blow, driving home the hopelessness of her situation. She was a rancher's daughter who'd never been more than 50 miles from home, thrust into a wilderness that could kill her in a dozen different ways before sunrise. "Then what do you suggest?" she asked, fighting to keep the despair out of her voice. The warrior considered her question with the same careful attention he'd given everything else. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of a momentous decision. "My people have a saying," he said. "When the eagle is wounded, it does not heal by flying higher into the storm. It finds shelter among the rocks until its strength returns." Clara frowned, trying to understand the meaning behind the metaphor. "You're offering me shelter. I am offering you a choice," the warrior replied. "Come with me to my camp, accept the protection of my lodge, and live. Or stay here and die when Morrison returns with 20 men instead of 4. The offer hung in the air between them like smoke from a sacred fire. Clara knew enough about frontier customs to understand what he was proposing: to accept shelter in a Lakota camp would mean placing herself under his protection, becoming his responsibility in the eyes of his people. It was a bond not entered into lightly. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you help a white woman you've never met?" The warrior's expression grew distant, and for a moment Clara thought he wouldn't answer. Then he spoke, his voice carrying old pain, like a scar that had never quite healed. "Because I know what it is to lose someone to men who take what they want without asking. Because the spirits brought you to this place at this time, and I will not ignore their guidance. Because... He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Because even eagles sometimes need the shelter of the mountain." Clara felt tears prick at her eyes, not from fear this time, but from something she hadn't expected to find in this desolate place. Compassion from a stranger who owed her nothing. "If I come with you," she said slowly, "what happens to me? What happens when your people discover you've brought a white woman into their camp?" "That," the warrior said, "will depend on you. My people judge by actions, not by the color of skin. Show respect, show courage, show that you understand the value of the life you've been given, and you will find acceptance. Act like the whites who come with guns and treaties written in lies. ... He shrugged eloquently. Clara looked around the canyon one more time, at the blood-stained ground where Morrison's men had fallen, at the narrow passage that led back to a world where she would always be nothing more than a commodity to be traded. Then she looked at the warrior who stood waiting for her decision with infinite patience. "I don't even know your name," she said. "I am called Chaitan," he replied, "falcon in your tongue. I am of the Outlaw band, son of Thunderhorse, keeper of the old ways." "Clara." "Whitmore," she said, then paused. That name belonged to the girl who'd worn silk dresses and served tea to her mother's friends. The woman standing in this canyon, holding a smoking gun and facing an uncertain future, needed something more. "Clara, ... just Clara." Chaitan nodded, as if he understood the significance of leaving part of her name behind. "Come then, Clara, just Clara. The darkness brings dangers we do not wish to meet." He moved to the rope he'd used to descend, but instead of climbing back up, he began fashioning a harness from the end. "You will ride double with me," he explained. "Your horse cannot make the journey where we must go." Clara's heart clenched at the thought of leaving Ginger behind. The mare had been her only companion through the long morning of flight, her only connection to the life she was abandoning. "She'll die out here alone," Clara said. "No," Chaitan replied with certainty. "I will release her near water. Horses are wiser than men. She will find her way to safety." Clara approached Ginger and stroked the mare's neck one last time, whispering words of gratitude and farewell. Then she removed the saddle and bridle, freeing the horse to find her own path. Ginger seemed to understand what was happening, nuzzling Clara's shoulder before trotting toward the canyon entrance with her head held high. Chaitan had fashioned a crude but effective climbing harness, and he helped Clara secure it around her waist. His hands were gentle but impersonal, treating her with the same careful respect he might show a wounded bird. "Hold tight," he said, and began to climb. The ascent was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Clara pressed her face against the warm stone of the canyon wall as Chaitan hauled them both upward with strength that seemed almost superhuman. His movements were precise and confident, finding handholds and footholds that were invisible to her untrained eye. When they finally reached the rim, Clara collapsed on solid ground, with her chest heaving and her muscles trembling from adrenaline. The view from the canyon rim was breathtaking, miles of broken badlands stretching in every direction, painted in sunset colors that made the harsh landscape look almost beautiful. Chaitan's horse waited nearby, a magnificent paint stallion with intelligent eyes and a coat of white and brown patches. The animal watched Clara's approach with calm acceptance, as if white women emerged from canyons in his presence every day. "His name is Wakanyela," Chaitan said, stroking the stallion's neck. "Thunder being, he will carry us both without complaint." Clara had ridden double before, but never on a horse she didn't know, and never with a man she'd met only an hour ago. But as Chaitan swung up into the saddle and extended his hand to her, she pushed aside her doubts and accepted his help mounting behind him. The sensation of sitting so close to him was startling. She could feel the warmth of his body through The buckskin shirt could smell the mixture of sage and wood smoke that clung to his hair. It was intimate in a way that made her acutely aware she was no longer in the world she'd grown up in, where such contact between unmarried men and women was forbidden. "Where are we going?" she asked as Chetan guided the stallion away from the canyon rim. "North," he replied, "to a place the whites do not know, where the old ways still hold power." They rode through the gathering darkness, following trails that seemed to exist more in Chetan's memory than on the ground itself. The stallion moved with sure-footed confidence across terrain that would have challenged even experienced riders. Guided by his master's silent communication and his own instinct for safe passage as the miles passed, Clara found herself relaxing. Despite her circumstances, there was something deeply reassuring about Chetan's competence, his obvious mastery of this harsh environment. For the first time since Morrison had entered her bedroom that morning, she felt truly safe. "Tell me about your people," she said, as they navigated a particularly treacherous stretch of broken ground. "Your band, your family." Chetan was quiet for so long that Clara thought he wouldn't answer. Then he began to speak, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air. "We are few now," he said. "Most of our people have been driven onto the reservation at Pine Ridge, where they wait for government rations and learn to be farmers instead of warriors. But some of us remember the old ways. Remember when the buffalo covered the plains like storm clouds and the land belonged to whoever was strong enough to hold it. Why didn't you go to the reservation with the others?" "Because I made a promise to my grandfather as he lay dying," Chetan replied. "I promised him that someone would keep the old ceremonies. Someone would remember the songs and the stories. Someone would make sure that the spirits of this land are not forgotten." Clara heard the weight of that promise in his voice, the burden of being one of the last guardians of a dying way of life. It made her own troubles seem small in comparison. "My grandfather also made me promise something," she said quietly. "He told me to never let anyone cage my spirit, no matter what they offered in return." Chetan turned slightly in the saddle, and Clara caught a glimpse of his profile in the starlight. "Then we both carry the weight of the dead," he said. "Perhaps that is why the spirits brought us together." They rode on through the night, two refugees from different worlds, united by their refusal to surrender their souls to the demands of others. Behind them, Clara's old life grew smaller with every mile. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the possibility of something she'd never dared hope for, a chance to discover who she really was when all the expectations and restrictions were stripped away. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, they reached the edge of a vast meadow hidden among the badlands like a secret garden. In the distance, Clara could see smoke rising from what looked like a small camptipis arranged in a circle around a central fire, horses grazing peacefully in the morning mist. "Welcome," Chetan said softly, "to the place where eagles learn to fly again." The Lakota camp materialized from the morning mist like something from a Vision 7 hide tipis, arranged in a perfect circle around a central fire that sent lazy spirals of smoke into the pale dawn sky. Clara had never seen anything like it. This harmonious blend of human habitation and natural landscape that seemed to grow from the earth itself rather than impose upon it. As Wakanyela carried them closer, Clara became aware of eyes watching their approach. Figures emerged from the tipis, men, women, and children whose faces showed mixtures of curiosity, wariness, and outright hostility, as they took in the sight of a white woman riding behind their returning warrior. Chetan felt the tension in Clara's body as she gripped his shirt more tightly. "Do not show fear," he said quietly. "Among my people, fear is seen as weakness, and weakness invites challenge." What should I do? Clara whispered back. Watch, listen, learn, and remember that respect must be earned, not demanded. They dismounted, near the largest tipi, where an elderly man with deeply lined features and eagle feathers woven into his iron-grey braids waited with the patience of stone. This had to be someone important. Clara could feel the deference of the others in the way they positioned themselves behind him, creating a semicircle of silent judgment. Chaton approached the elder and spoke rapidly in Lakota, his hands moving, in gestures that seemed to add layers of meaning to his words. Clara caught her own name mentioned several times, along with what sounded like the Lakota word for blackjack, Sapa Tisla, which seemed to translate roughly to black-hearted one. The elder's dark eyes fixed on Clara with an intensity that made her feel as if he were looking into her very soul. When Shaitan finished speaking, the old man stepped forward and began to circle Clara slowly, examining her with the thoroughness of someone evaluating a horse for purchase. "I am Thunder Horse," he said finally, his English accented but clear. "Father to the one who brought you here. I see you wear the clothes of a man but move like a woman who has never known hardship. I see hands that are soft from easy living, but eyes that burn with the fire of one who has chosen a difficult path." Clara forced herself to meet his gaze directly, remembering Chaitan's advice about showing strength rather than submission. "I am Clara. I seek shelter among your people because the alternative is a life of slavery to a man who collects women like trophies." Thunder Horse's weathered face showed no emotion, but something flickered in his eyes, perhaps approval of her directness. "The black-hearted one has killed many of our warriors, stolen our horses, burned our winter camps. Why should we risk his anger by sheltering his intended bride?" The question hung in the air like a blade suspended over Clara's head. She sensed that this was a test, that Heron's whir would determine whether she found sanctuary or was cast out to face Morrison's vengeance alone. "Because," Clara said, drawing on every ounce of courage she possessed, "sometimes the enemy of your enemy can become your ally. Morrison doesn't just threaten me, he threatens anyone who refuses to bend to his will. If you help me escape him, you strike a blow against a man who has caused your people great suffering." Thunder Horse's expression remained unreadable, but Clara caught a glimpse of what might have been respect in his dark eyes. He turned to address the gathered tribe in rapid Lakota, sparking an immediate and heated discussion. Voices rose and fell, hands gestured emphatically, and Clara found herself the focus of intense scrutiny from every person present. A middle-aged woman with intricate beadwork decorating her doeskin dress stepped forward and spoke sharply to Thunder Horse, her tone leaving no doubt about her opinion of harboring a white woman. Others joined the argument, some supporting her position, others seeming to defend Chaton's decision. "What are they saying?" Clara asked Chaton quietly. "Winona believes you will bring soldiers down upon us," he replied. "She thinks the risk is too great for one outsider, especially a white woman who may be more trouble than she is worth. And what do you think?" Chaitan looked at her for a long moment, his dark eyes unreadable. "I think the spirits do not make mistakes in their guidance. You are here for a reason, even if we do not yet understand what that reason might be." The argument continued for several more minutes before Thunder Horse raised his hand for silence. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of absolute leadership. "The woman will stay," he announced, in English for Clara's benefit, "but she will not be given the status of guest. She must prove her worth to this band, must show that she can contribute to our survival rather than threaten it. If she succeeds, she will be welcomed as one of us. If she fails—" He didn't finish the sentence. but his meaning was clear enough. "What must I do?" Clara asked. Thunderhorse smiled for the first time since their arrival, and the expression transformed his stern features completely. "First, you must learn to be Lakota. Winona will teach you the proper way to set up a lodge, to prepare food, to make clothing that will not mark you as Wasaku white person from a distance. You will work alongside our women and learn their skills." Clara nodded, though her stomach clenched at the thought of trying to master skills that Lakota women learned from childhood. "I understand, but that is only the beginning," Thunderhorse continued. "When the moon is full again 7 days from now, you will face the same trial that our young women must pass to be considered adults. You will spend 3 days and nights alone in the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on your back, finding your own food, making your own shelter, surviving by your own skills and wisdom." The silence that followed this pronouncement was deafening. Clara felt the blood drain from her face as the implications sank in. She'd barely survived 1 day of flight across the prairie, and that had been with a horse, supplies, and pure desperation driving her forward. 3 days alone in the wilderness seemed like a death sentence. "And if I fail?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Then the spirits will decide your fate," Thunderhorse replied simply, "as they decide all things." Chatton stepped forward, his expression troubled. "Father, she is not prepared for such a trial. She has not had years to learn the skills our women possess. Then she has 7 days to learn what others learn in 7 years." Thunderhorse said firmly, "If she is truly meant to be among us, the spirits will guide her. If not," he shrugged eloquently. The crowd began to disperse, some of the tribal members casting curious or hostile glances at Clara as they returned to their morning tasks. Winona approached with obvious reluctance, her dark eyes studying Clara with the same thoroughness Thunderhorse had shown. "Come," she said in heavily accented English. "We waste daylight with talking." The next 7 days passed like a blur of desperate learning and constant humiliation. Winona proved to be a demanding teacher who had no patience for Clara's mistakes, or her soft hands that blistered and bled from unaccustomed work. Clara learned to scrape hides until her arms ached and her back screamed in protest. She discovered that setting up a tipi required not just strength, but an understanding of wind patterns, ground conditions, and structural engineering that the Lakota women seemed to absorb through their very pores. Her first attempts at traditional cooking were disasters that would have been comedic if the consequences weren't so serious. She burned meat over the fire, ruined perfectly good roots by digging them up incorrectly, and nearly poisoned herself trying to identify edible plants. "Wasaku women," Winona muttered after Clara's 3rd failed attempt to tan a buffalo hide properly. Soft as new grass, useless as winter snow. But Clara refused to give up. Every failure only strengthened her determination to prove herself worthy of the sanctuary she'd been offered. She studied the other women with desperate intensity, memorizing their techniques and practicing in secret whenever she could steal a few minutes alone. Gradually, she began to improve. Her hands grew calloused and strong from the constant work. Her back straightened as she learned to carry heavy loads without complaint. Most importantly, she began to understand the rhythms of Lakota life, the way every action served a purpose, the way nothing was wasted, the way survival depended on cooperation and shared knowledge. The children were her greatest allies in this process. Unlike the adults, who maintained a careful distance, the young ones were fascinated by this strange white woman who spoke their language so poorly and made such amusing mistakes. They taught her games that improved her coordination, songs that helped her remember important skills, and stories that gave her insight into Lakota values and beliefs. A boy named Little Eagle, perhaps 8 years old, became particularly attached to Clara. He followed her around the camp like a devoted puppy, correcting her pronunciation and demonstrating proper techniques with the serious demeanor of a tiny teacher. "You must learn to think like the earth," he told her one afternoon as she struggled to start a fire using traditional methods. "Fire lives in the wood, but it sleeps. You must wake it gently, like waking a baby." Under his patient guidance, Clara finally managed to coax flame from flint and steel, then from bow drill, then from the most challenging method of outcreating fire through friction using nothing but dry wood and determination. Her success with fire-making marked a turning point in her acceptance by the tribe. Women who had previously ignored her began to nod in acknowledgement when she passed. Men stopped their conversations to watch her practice with obvious interest rather than hostility. Even Winona began to show grudging approval of Clara's progress. "You learn faster than I expected," she admitted after Clara successfully completed a complex beadwork pattern without guidance. "Perhaps you are not entirely hopeless." But it was Chaitan's quiet pride in her achievements that meant the most. To Clara, he said little during those 7 days, respecting the tradition that required her to learn from the women of the tribe. But she caught him watching her sometimes, his dark eyes reflecting something that might have been admiration mixed with concern. On the 6th evening, as Clara sat by the central fire practicing the intricate finger movements required for proper sign language, Chaitan approached and settled beside her on the buffalo robe she'd learned to prepare herself. "Tomorrow begins your trial," he said quietly. "Are you ready?" Clara looked down at her hands, no longer soft and pale, but brown from sun and wind, marked with small scars from her learning process. She thought about everything she'd absorbed in the past week, all the skills she'd barely begun to master. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "But I know I'm not the same person who rode into this camp 7 days ago." "No," Chaitan agreed. "That person could never have survived what you must face tomorrow. What if I fail?" Clara asked, voicing the fear that had been growing stronger with each passing day. Chaitan was quiet for a long moment, staring into the dancing flames. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "You will not fail," he said, "because Valor means returning to the life you fled, and I have seen your spirit. You would rather die free than live in captivity." That night, Clara lay awake in the small tipi Winona had grudgingly allowed her to share, staring up at the smoke hole where stars gleamed like distant campfires. Tomorrow, she would be taken to a remote location in the Badlands and left with nothing but her clothes and her wits. For 3 days and nights, she would have to survive using only what the land provided and what she'd managed to learn in her week among the Lakota. It should have been terrifying, and part of her was certainly afraid. But beneath the fear was something stronger, fierce determination that had been growing since the moment she'd first drawn her grandfather's gun on Blackjack Morrison. She was no longer Clara Whitmore, the rancher's daughter who'd been raised to be ornamental and obedient. She was no longer the frightened girl who'd fled into the wilderness with no plan beyond escape. She was becoming someone new, someone who could face the darkness without flinching. And tomorrow, she would discover exactly who that person might be. Outside her tipi, she could hear the night sounds of the camp, the soft murmur of voices around dying fires, the restless movement of horses in the remuda, the distant call of a coyote singing to the moon. Soon, she would be alone with those sounds and whatever dangers they might herald. But for the first time since Morrison had entered her bedroom with that obscene necklace, Clara Whitmore was not afraid of what tomorrow might bring. She was ready to meet it head-on. The blindfold came off with a sharp tug, and Clara blinked in. The harsh afternoon sunlight as her eyes adjusted to reveal the most desolate landscape she'd ever seen. Jagged stone formations jutted from the earth like broken teeth, creating a maze of canyons and dead ends that stretched to the horizon. No water glinted in the distance. No green vegetation softened the brutal angles of rock and sand. Thunder. Horse sat mounted beside her, his weathered face showing no emotion as he studied her. Reaction to the barren wasteland where she would spend the next 3 days. "This is the place of testing," he said in English, his voice carrying the weight of ancient tradition. "Here, our young women learn whether they possess the spirit of the eagle or the rabbit." Clara slid down from the horse she'd shared for the 2-hour ride from camp, her legs already stiff from the journey. The silence here was absolute. No birdsong, no rustle of wind through grass, just the whisper of sand against stone and the thundering of her own heartbeat. "The rules are simple," Thunder Horse continued, making no move to dismount. "You may take nothing with you but the clothes you wear. You must find water, shelter, and food using only what the land provides. If you are still alive when the sun reaches this position 3 days from now," he pointed to a distinctive rock formation, "you will have proven yourself worthy to be called Lakota." Clara nodded, her throat already dry despite having drunk deeply before the journey began. "And if I'm not alive?" Thunder Horse's eyes glittered with something that might have been respect. "Then the spirits will have made their judgment, and we will honor your courage in the singing of your death song." The casual way he spoke of her potential death should have been terrifying, but Clara found it oddly comforting. There was no false sympathy here, no meaningless reassurances, just the harsh honesty of a people who had survived for generations by understanding that the world owed them nothing. "I understand," she said. Thunder Horse reached into a leather pouch and withdrew something that made Clara's blood run colder. Human scalp, the hair still braided with silver ornaments in the Lakota style. He held it up so she could see it clearly. "This belonged to my daughter, Ayana," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "She was taken by the black-hearted one 6 moons ago when she went to gather healing plants near the white settlement. He kept her for 3 days before ... double quotes. Thunder Horse's jaw tightened. "Before he grew tired of her and let his men finish what he had started." Clara stared at the scalp, seeing not just hair and skin but the brutal end of a young woman who had probably been about her own age. The full weight of what Morrison was capable of crashed over her like a physical blow. "Why are you showing me this?" she whispered. "Because you need to understand what waits for you if you fail," Thunder Horse replied. "Not just death, but something far worse. My daughter was strong, trained from birth in the ways of survival, yet she could not escape the black-hearted one. Once he had claimed her, he fixed Clara with his penetrating stare. You are soft, white, raised in comfort. If you cannot survive 3 days in this place, you will surely die in his hands within 3 hours." The old warrior tucked the scalp back into his pouch and gathered his horse's reins. "The spirits will guide you if you listen with more than your ears. Remember what Winona taught you. Remember what Little Eagle showed you. But most of all, remember why you chose this path." With that, he rode away, leaving Clara alone in the wasteland with nothing but her courage and the desperate hope that a week of intensive training had been enough to keep her alive. The first hour was the worst. Clara stood frozen in place. overwhelmed by the vast emptiness surrounding her and the impossibility of what she was being asked to do. 3 days in this hellscape seemed as insurmountable as climbing to the moon. But as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the rock formations in shades of gold and crimson, Clara forced herself to move. The first priority was shelter. She'd learned enough from Winona to know that exposure would kill her long before thirst or hunger had a chance. She began exploring the maze of stone, looking for a cave or overhang that could provide protection from the elements. The rocks held the day's heat like pottery fresh from a kiln, burning her hands when she touched them for support. But as she climbed higher into the formations, she began to feel the first stirrings of air movement, not quite a breeze, but enough to suggest that wind patterns might create cooler pockets among the stones. It was Little Eagle's voice she heard in her memory as she searched. The earth speaks to those who know how to listen. Look for the signs. She leaves green plants mean water below, smooth stones mean wind and rain, white salt means death. Clara found herself studying the rock faces with new eyes, looking for the subtle clues that might reveal the secrets of this harsh place. Here, a streak of mineral staining suggested water had flowed down the stone face during rains. There, a cluster of stunted plants clung to life in a protected crevice, their roots reaching deep into hidden moisture. As the light began to fade, Clara discovered what she'd been looking for: a shallow cave carved into the cliff face by millennia of wind and water. It wasn't large, barely big enough for her to lie down in, but it would provide shelter from the night wind and any predators that might roam these badlands after dark. The cave floor was littered with debris, old bones, dried plant matter, and the unmistakable signs that animals had used this shelter before her. Clara spent precious minutes clearing out the worst of the mess, creating a clean space where she could rest without fear of snakes or scorpions sharing her bed. With shelter secured, she turned her attention to the next critical need: water. The mineral staining on the rocks suggested that rain runoff collected somewhere nearby, but Clara could see no obvious source. She would have to dig and dig deep, following the subtle signs that Winona had taught her to recognize. At the base of the cliff, where the mineral staining was heaviest, Clara began to excavate with her bare hands and a sharp piece of broken stone. The work was backbreaking, made worse by the fading light and her own mounting thirst. Her hands were soon bloody from the sharp rocks, her fingernails broken and torn from clawing at the unyielding earth. But just as full darkness fell, her fingers touched something wet. Not the flowing water she'd hoped for, but seepage, moisture to sustain life if she could collect it efficiently. Working by feel in the darkness, Clara fashioned a crude basin from flat stones and bark, creating a small reservoir where the precious water could accumulate drop by drop. By midnight, she had perhaps half a cup of muddy, gritty water. It tasted like earth and minerals and hope, and Clara rationed it carefully, allowing herself only small sips to wet her parched throat. The second day began with a crisis that nearly ended. Her trial before it had truly begun. Clara woke to find her water basin overturned, its precious contents soaked into the thirsty ground. Animal tracks in the mud told the story a coyote had come to drink during the night and had accidentally destroyed her carefully constructed collection system. For a moment, Clara sat in the growing heat of the morning sun and seriously considered walking out into the desert to die. The setbacks seemed insurmountable, the task impossible. But then she heard another voice from her weak in the Kamchatan's voice. Speaking quietly by the fire, The difference between those who survive and those who die is not strength or skill, but the refusal to surrender even when surrender seems reasonable. Clara rebuilt her water collection system, this time creating multiple basins and positioning them more carefully to avoid future accidents. The work took most of the morning, but by noon she had a steady, if minimal, supply of water trickling into her makeshift reservoirs. With her immediate survival needs addressed, Clara turned her attention to food. The landscape seemed utterly barren, but she knew from her training that even the harshest environments supported life if you knew where to look. She began a systematic search of the area around her shelter, turning over rocks, examining crevices, and looking for the subtle signs of edible plants or small animals. Under a large boulder, she found a colony of insects that looked edible fat, white grubs that made her stomach churn but represented precious protein. Choking down her revulsion, Clara forced herself to eat them raw, gagging on their bitter taste but grateful for any nutrition she could find. As the day progressed, she made other discoveries. A patch of prickly pear cactus growing in a protected hollow yielded both edible pads and precious moisture when she carefully removed the spines. A small lizard, sluggish from the morning cold, provided another source of protein. Most importantly, she found a cluster of plants that Winona had shown. Her bitter root, which could be processed into a nutritious flour if prepared correctly. The processing was complex and time-consuming, requiring her to dig up the roots, pound them with stones to break down the fibers, and then leach out the bitter compounds with repeated washings. But by evening, Clara had produced a small amount of bitter root flour that she mixed with water to create a paste that, while hardly appetizing, would keep her alive. The second night brought new challenges. The temperature dropped dramatically after sunset, and Clara found herself shivering in her inadequate clothing despite the shelter of the cave. She had no materials for a proper fire, and even if she had, the smoke might attract unwanted attention from predators, or worse. Instead, she used techniques Winona had demonstrated for staying warm in extreme conditions. She gathered dry grass and leaves to create insulation around her body, curled into a tight ball to conserve heat, and practiced the breathing exercises she'd learned for maintaining core temperature. It was a miserable night of broken sleep and constant cold, but she survived it. The third day brought the greatest test of all. Clara woke to the sound that had haunted her nightmares since fleeing her father's ranch, the distant thunder of approaching horses. Through a gap in the rocks, she could see dust rising in the distance, and her heart sank as she recognized the dark figures of riders moving across the wasteland. Morrison had found her, but how? The location of the trial ground was supposed to be a closely guarded secret, known only to the Lakota and protected by their ancient traditions. Yet there was no mistaking the purposeful way the riders moved, or the black duster worn by the man leading them. Clara counted 6 riders Morrison and 5 of his men, heavily armed and moving with the confidence of hunters who had cornered their prey. She watched from her hidden position as they approached the base of the rock formation, their horses picking their way carefully across the broken ground. "I know you're up there, Sugar." Morrison's voice echoed off the stone walls, magnified and distorted by the natural acoustics of the place. "Come on down now, and maybe I'll be gentle with you. Make me climb up there after you, and—" He let the threat hang unfinished. Clara's mind raced as she considered her options. She could try to hide and hope they would give up the search, but Morrison was nothing if not persistent. She could attempt to climb higher into the rocks, but that would only delay the inevitable while exposing her to their gunfire. or she could make a stand here, in this place where she had learned to survive against impossible odds. The choice, when it came, was easier than she'd expected. Clara thought about Thunderhorse's daughter, about the scalp that represented not just death, but the complete destruction of everything that made a person human. She thought about the bone necklace Morrison had forced her to wear, and the cold hunger in his eyes when he looked at her. Most of all, she thought about the woman she had become in this harsh place, not the frightened girl who had fled her. Father's ranch, but someone harder, stronger, more dangerous than Morrison could possibly imagine. Clara reached for the sharp stone she had used for digging, testing its weight and balance in her hand. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was what she had, and sometimes, as the Lakota knew better than anyone, a person with nothing left to lose was the most dangerous opponent of all. "Come and get me, Morrison," she called down from her hiding place, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Let's finish this." The sound of spurs on stone told her that he had accepted her challenge. The final confrontation was about to begin, and Clara Whitmore, or of Thunderhorse, sister to the Eagle people, survivor of the trial of fire and stone, was ready to meet it with courage born from the hardest 3 days of her life. Whatever happened next, she would face it as herself, unbroken and unafraid. Morrison's laughter echoed off the canyon walls like the howl of a rabid wolf as his boots scraped against stone, each step bringing him closer to Clara's hiding place. She pressed herself deeper into the shadow of her cave, the sharp rock clutched in her trembling hand as she listened to the methodical search below. "You know what I'm going to do to you when I find you, sugar," Morrison called out, his voice dripping with malicious pleasure. "First, I'm going to make you watch while my boys have some fun with that pretty little Injun camp you've been hiding in. Then I'm going to take my time with you, teach you some manners before I drag you back home for our wedding." Night. Clara's blood turned to ice. Morrison knew about the Lakota camp. Somehow, he'd discovered not just her location, but the existence of the people who had given her sanctuary. The thought of Chatton, Thunderhorse, Little Eagle, and even Stern, Winona falling victim to Morrison's vengeance because of her presence, made her stomach clench with guilt and rage. "How did you find me?" she called back, stalling for time while her mind raced through possible escape routes. "Wasn't too hard once we put the pieces together," Morrison replied, his voice growing closer as he climbed. "See, that cavalry patrol. You ran into... They mentioned seeing some interesting tracks near your daddy's ranch. Horse tracks, but not shod like white men's horses. Indian ponies, heading north toward the Badlands." Clara cursed silently. She'd been so focused on escaping Morrison that she hadn't considered how her rescue might compromise Chatton and his people. "Then we had ourselves a little chat with a trader named Pete Kozłowski," Morrison continued, his breathing slightly labored from the climb, but his voice still carrying that predatory amusement. "Pete's been doing business with renegade Injuns for years, knows all their hidey holes. Cost me $50 and a bottle of whiskey, but Pete was real helpful about where a small band might hole up in this country." A new voice joined the conversation, of Morrison's men calling from below. "Boss, found something you're gonna want to see." Morrison's climbing stopped, and Clara heard the scrape of boots heading back down through a crack in the stone. She watched as Morrison descended to where one of his men stood holding something that made her heart skip a beat. It was one of Chayton's arrows, the same distinctive craftsmanship that had saved her life in the first canyon. The warrior must have come looking for her, tracking Morrison's men to this place, and now his presence had been discovered. Well, Morrison said, examining the arrow with professional interest. "Looks like we got ourselves a whole nest of problems to clean up. Scar, take Jimmy and circle around to the north rim. If there's Injuns watching this place, I want M spotted before they can cause trouble." As two of his men departed to search for Chatton, Morrison resumed his climb with renewed purpose. Clara knew her time was running out. In minutes, he would reach her hiding place, and then her 3 days of survival would end in exactly the kind of horror she'd fled her father's ranch to avoid. But something had changed in those 3 days. The woman Morrison was hunting was not the same frightened girl who had run from an ivory wedding dress. Clara had learned to survive on bitter roots and muddy water, had faced the absolute darkness of the Badlands without flinching, had discovered reserves of strength she never knew existed. Most importantly, she had learned what it meant to choose her own fate. Clara emerged from her cave as Morrison rounded the final bend, standing silhouetted against the morning sky with her makeshift weapon held ready. The outlaw leader stopped short, his scarred face splitting into a grin as he took in her transformed appearance. Gone was the soft rancher's daughter with smooth hands and clean clothes. In her place stood a sun-darkened woman with calloused palms, hair braided with grass, and small bones in the Lakota style. Wearing buckskin leggings, she'd fashioned herself from materials scavenged in the wilderness. Even her posture had changed. She stood balanced on the balls of her feet, ready to move in any direction, like a mountain cat preparing to strike. My, Morrison said, holstering his guns with deliberate slowness. 3 days with the savages, and look what you've become. Almost makes a man think you might be worth the trouble after all." "The only thing I've become," Clara replied, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her throat, "is someone who knows the difference between a man and a rabid animal." Morrison's grin widened. "You always did have a smart mouth, Gona. Enjoy teaching you when to use it and when to keep it shut." He lunged forward with surprising speed for such a large man, but Clara was ready. Her week with the Lakota had taught her more than survival skills. Chatton had shown her how to move like water, flowing around obstacles instead of meeting them. Head on, she slipped sideways as Morrison's hands grasped at empty air, then struck with the sharp stone, opening a gash along his ribs that made him roar with pain and fury. "You little wildcat." Morrison spun, one hand pressed to his bleeding side while the other reached for his knife. I was going to be gentle, but now an arrow sprouted from his shoulder, spinning him around and sending his blade clattering across the rocks. Morrison staggered, his face twisted with shock and rage as he stared up at the canyon rim where Chaitan stood silhouetted against the sky like an avenging spirit. "The woman is under my protection," Chaitan called down, his voice carrying the authority of ancient laws older than any white man's court. "Release her and go, and you may leave this place alive." Morrison's response was a stream of curses that would have made a cavalry sergeant blush, followed by a desperate grab for one of his fallen revolvers. But Clara was closer, and desperation gave her speed. She kicked the weapon away, sending it skittering into a crevice where Morrison couldn't reach it. "Seems like you're outnumbered," Clara said, backing toward a narrow ledge that led to higher ground. "Maybe," Morrison panted, blood seeping through his fingers, "but I got something you don't." He put 2 fingers to his lips and whispered, sharp, piercing sound that echoed off the canyon walls like a signal. Within seconds, Clara heard answering calls from multiple directions. Morrison hadn't come with just the 6 men she'd counted. He'd brought his entire gang, and they'd been positioned around the canyon to prevent exactly this kind of interference. Gunfire erupted from the canyon floor. As Morrison's hidden men opened up on Chaitan's position, the Lakota warrior vanished behind the rocks as bullets sparked off stone around him. But Clara could hear the distinctive sound of his bow answering their guns, the whisper of arrows finding targets, followed by screams of pain and rage. "Your boyfriend's good," Morrison admitted, wrapping his bandana around his wounded shoulder. "But arrows don't beat bullets in the long run. My boys'll finish him soon enough, and then it'll be just you and me again." Clara looked around desperately for another weapon, another advantage, anything that might help even the odds. The ledge she stood on was perhaps 20 feet above Morrison, connected to his position by a narrow, treacherous path that switched back across the cliff face. If she could reach the higher ground, she might be able to. Morrison's hand closed around her ankle like a steel trap. "Going somewhere?" he asked, his grip tightening as he hauled himself up toward her position despite his wounds. Clara struck at his hand with her stone weapon, but Morrison was ready this time. He caught her wrist in his free hand and squeezed until she gasped. In pain, the sharp rock falling from her nerveless fingers. "That's better," Morrison said, pulling himself onto the ledge beside her. "Now we can have ourselves a proper conversation." Below them, the gunfight continued to rage, but the sounds were growing more sporadic. Either Chaitan was running out of arrows or Morrison's men were finding their range. Either way, Clara knew she was running out of time. "What do you want from me?" she asked, trying to keep Morrison talking while she looked for another opportunity. "What?" "I've always wanted," Morrison replied, his scarred face inches from hers. "A wife who knows her place. A woman who'll give me sons and keep her mouth shut about my business. A pretty little decoration for my arm when I need to impress important folks. And you think forcing me into marriage will accomplish that?" Morrison's laugh was like the rattle of a diamondback. "Darling, by the time I'm done breaking you in, you'll be grateful for whatever scraps of affection I throw your way. I've tamed wilder horses than you." The casual certainty in his voice, the absolute conviction that he could break her spirit and remake her into whatever image pleased him, filled Clara with a rage so pure it felt like fire in her veins. This was what awaited every woman who fell into Morrison's hands, not just death, but the complete destruction of everything that made them human. "There's just one problem with your plan," Clara said quietly. "What's that, sugar? I'm not a horse." Clara drove her knee into Morrison's wounded ribs with all the strength she could muster, feeling something crack under the impact. Grip loosened as he doubled over in agony, and Clara twisted free, scrambling toward the higher ledges. But Morrison was tough as old leather and twice as mean. Even wounded, he was faster than she expected. His hand closed around her boot as she climbed, dragging her back down toward him with inexorable strength. "You're gonna pay for that?" Morrison snarled, blood flecking his lips. "Gonna pay for every bit of trouble you've caused me." Clara felt herself sliding backward, her fingernails scraping uselessly against smooth stone as Morrison hauled her toward him. This was at the end of her brief taste of freedom, the beginning of a nightmare that would last until Morrison grew tired of his latest toy. Then she heard it a sound like thunder, but wrong somehow, rhythmic and getting closer. Morrison heard it too, his head turning toward the canyon entrance as understanding dawned on his scarred features. "No," he whispered. "Not possible." The sound resolved into what it actually was. Dozens of horses, running hard, coming fast. As the first riders appeared at the canyon mouth, Clara's heart leaped with impossible hope. It was Thunder Horse, leading what looked like every warrior from 3 different bands. Their faces painted for war, and their weapons gleaming in the morning sun. Behind them came women and older children, all armed, all wearing the grim expressions of people who had come to settle a blood debt, the black-hearted one. Thunder Horse's voice boomed across the canyon. Face the judgment of the people you have wronged. Morrison's men, caught between Chattan's arrows from above and the approaching war party from below, began to break. Some tried to surrender, others attempted to flee, but none escaped the swift justice of warriors who had been hunting this particular enemy for years. In the chaos of the battle below, Morrison made one last desperate gamble. He drew a hidden derringer from his boot and pressed it against Clara's temple, backing toward the edge of the ledge with her as a human shield. "Call them off," he shouted down at Thunder Horse. "Call them off, or I blow her brains out right here." The old war. Chief raised his hand, and the shooting stopped as suddenly as it had begun. In the sudden silence, Morrison's harsh breathing was clearly audible as he pressed the gun harder against Clara's skull. "Smart choice," Morrison said. "Now, here's what's gonna happen. You're gonna let me and my remaining boys ride out of here, peaceful-like, and in exchange, you get the girl back alive. Fight me, and she dies. Simple as that." Clara could feel Morrison's hand shaking as he held the derringer, could smell the fierce sweat on him despite his confident words. He was trapped and he knew it, but he was still dangerous as a cornered rattlesnake. "You have made one mistake," Thunder Horse called up from below, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Yeah, what's that? You assume she is still the frightened girl you came here to claim." Clara felt Morrison's confusion in the slight relaxation of his grip and knew this was her only chance. 3 days in the wilderness had taught her many things, but the most important lesson was this: sometimes the only way to survive is to do something so unexpected that your enemy cannot prepare for it. Instead of trying to break free, Clara threw herself backward, driving Morrison toward the edge of the ledge with all her weight. His arms windmilled desperately as he tried to regain his balance, the derringer flying from his grasp as he teetered on the brink of the 20-foot drop. For a moment, Morrison seemed to hang suspended in space, his eyes wide with the terrible understanding of what was about to happen. Then gravity claimed him, and he plummeted toward the rocks below with a scream that cut off abruptly when he hit. Clara lay on the ledge for a long moment, her whole body shaking with reaction as the reality of what she'd done sank in. Black Jack Morrison, the terror of the Dakota Territory, was dead, and she had killed him below. Thunder Horse and his warriors were securing the few surviving members of Morrison's gang, binding their wounds and preparing them for the long journey to face frontier justice. But Clara's attention was focused on a familiar figure climbing up the cliff face toward her. Chattan, moving with his usual fluid grace despite the bullet graze across his left arm. "Clara," he said softly as he reached her side. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, not trusting her voice. Chattan gathered her gently in his arms, holding her while the aftershock of violence and survival ran its course through her trembling body. "It's over," he murmured into her hair. "The black-hearted one will never threaten anyone again." As Clara clung to Chattan's solid warmth, she realized that he was right. It was over. But something new was beginning. Something that would require different kinds of courage than what she'd needed to survive the past 3 days. She had passed the trial of fire and stone, had proven herself worthy to be called Lakota. But now came the harder test, learning how to live with the knowledge of what she was capable of when pushed to the very edge of human endurance. Thunder Horse's voice carried up from below, speaking in Lakota. But Clara understood enough to know he was calling her name, not Clara Whitmore, but the new name she had earned through blood and determination, the Hinchalasan she who stands. With eagles, it was time to discover what that name would mean for the woman she had become. 3 moons had passed since Black Jack Morrison's blood had stained the sacred stones, and the woman who had once been Clara Whitmore stood at the edge of the great council circle, watching the flames dance against the star-filled sky. Tonight was different from all the nights that had come before tonight. The scattered bands of the Lakota nation had gathered to witness something that had not occurred in living memory: the formal adoption of a white woman into the tribe, T'Hinchalasanwinch, who stands with Eagles wore the ceremonial dress that had taken Winona and 12 other women 6 weeks to complete. Every bead had been placed with prayer, every quill had been dyed with sacred herbs, every stitch had been sewn with the intention of transforming an outsider into family. The dress itself was a masterpiece of Lakota artistry, decorated with intricate patterns that told the story of her trials and triumphs, her death as Clara Whitmore and rebirth as something entirely new. But it wasn't the dress that marked her. Transformation, it was everything else. The way she moved with the silent confidence of someone who had faced death and chosen life. The calloused hands that could fashion arrows or tend wounds with equal skill. The eyes that held depths of knowledge about survival, sacrifice, and the true cost of freedom. Most telling of all was the way the children of the camp flocked to her, drawn by the stories she told and the strange perspective she brought to familiar lessons. Little Eagle, now her constant shadow, sat cross-legged beside her as they waited for the ceremony to begin, his young face serious with the importance of the occasion. "Are you nervous, 8?" he asked, using the Lakota word for mother. That had become his name for her. "A little," she admitted, her fluency in Lakota now good enough for complex conversations. "This is a great honor your grandfather, Thunderhorse, has chosen to give me. I hope I prove worthy of it." "You killed the black-hearted one," Little Eagle said with the matter-of-fact tone children used for absolute truths. "You survived the trial of fire and stone. You learned our ways faster than anyone thought possible. Of course you're worthy." From his innocent perspective, it was that simple. But Clara knew the reality was far more complex. The 3 moons since Morrison's death had been filled with challenges that made her wilderness survival. Trial seemed straightforward by comparison. The first challenge had come from within the Lakota community itself. Not everyone had been pleased with Thunderhorse's decision to adopt her formally into the tribe. Some of the traditional families worried about setting a precedent that might encourage other whites to demand similar acceptance. Others questioned whether someone who had been raised in the white world could ever truly understand the spiritual responsibilities that came with being Lakota. The most vocal opposition had come from a war chief named Red Hawk, whose own daughter had been killed in a cavalry raid 2 years earlier. Red Hawk's grief had transformed into a burning hatred for all whites, and he saw Clara's presence as an insult to his daughter's memory. "Why should we welcome the enemy into our lodges?" he had demanded during one particularly heated council meeting. "Why should we share our sacred ceremonies with someone whose people seek to destroy us?" Clara had wanted to defend herself, to argue that she had chosen to reject everything the white world represented. But Chetan had placed a gentle hand on her arm, reminding her that among the Lakota, wisdom was demonstrated through listening rather than speaking, through actions rather than words, so she had remained silent and let her behavior answer Red Hawk's objections. When a fever struck the camp and the traditional healers were overwhelmed, Clara worked tirelessly to nurse the sick, drawing on knowledge she'd gained from her grandmother's herb garden and combining it with Lakota healing practices. When a late-season blizzard trapped the band for 5 days, Clara's foraging skills helped stretch their food supplies until the storm passed. Most importantly, when a group of drunk cavalry soldiers from Fort Robinson had ridden into camp looking for trouble, Clara had been the one to defuse the situation through careful diplomacy, speaking to the soldiers in their own language while maintaining the dignity and authority of her adopted people. Gradually, Red Hawk's opposition had softened. The turning point had come when his own grandson had been bitten by a rattlesnake while playing near the horse herd. Clara's quick application of traditional snakebite remedies, combined with her steady presence during the long hours of uncertainty, had helped save the boy's life. Red Hawk never formally apologized for his earlier hostility, but he began including Clara in conversations and asking her opinion on matters of importance to the tribe. The second challenge had been more personal and infinitely more complex. Her relationship with the attraction between them had been obvious from their first meeting, but acting on those feelings required navigating cultural expectations and spiritual traditions that Clara was still learning to understand. Among the Lakota, courtship was a formal process that involved not just the couple, but their entire extended families. Gift-giving, ritual demonstrations of worthiness, and elaborate ceremonies all played a role in cementing relationships that were seen as unions between clans rather than simple romantic partnerships. Chayton had begun the courtship properly, bringing gifts to Thunderhorse and asking permission to pursue his interest in Clara. The old war chief had been surprisingly receptive, perhaps seeing the political advantages of linking his adopted daughter to one of the band's most respected warriors. But he had also insisted on a waiting period time for Clara to fully understand what it meant to be Lakota before she committed to spending her life among them. The waiting had been tortured for both of them. They were together constantly during the daily life of the camp, working side by side, sharing meals, participating in the endless round of tasks that kept the band functioning. The tension between them grew stronger with each passing day, crackling like electricity before a thunderstorm. Whenever their hands accidentally touched or their eyes met across the fire, 3 weeks ago, the waiting had finally ended. Chayton had approached her formally, in full view of the assembled tribe, carrying a magnificent painted horse as a bride gift for Thunderhorse. The ceremony that followed had been unlike anything Clara could have imagined. Part spiritual ritual, part community celebration, part solemn contract binding to people, not just to each other, but to the continuation of Lakota tradition. Now she wore Chayton's marriage necklace alongside her adoption regalia, the carved bone and silver pieces, warm against her throat. But tonight's ceremony would complete her transformation in a way that even marriage could not tonight. She would become Lakota not just in name and relationship, but in the deepest spiritual sense. The drumming began suddenly, the ancient rhythm that spoke directly to the human heart without need for words or understanding. One by one, the elders emerged from the largest tipi, their faces painted with sacred designs, their ceremonial regalia catching the firelight like captured stars. Thunderhorse led the procession, but Clara's attention was drawn to the figure, walking beside him, an ancient woman whose face was so lined with age that she seemed more spirit than flesh. This was Grandmother Sage, the keeper of the old ceremonies, whose presence at tonight's adoption was both an honor and a necessity. "Come forward, she who stands with eagles," Thunderhorse called, his voice carrying the authority of generations of chiefs. Clara rose gracefully, conscious of the weight of every eye upon her as she walked toward the circle of elders. Behind her, she could feel the presence of her new family Chaitan, Winona, Little Eagle, and all the others who had accepted her not because she was white or because she had wealth or connections, but because she had proven herself worthy through her actions. Grandmother Sage stepped forward, her ancient eyes sharp with intelligence despite her obvious age. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but the acoustics of the circle carried her words clearly to every person present. Long ago, she began, when the world was younger and the spirits walked more freely among us. There was a prophecy spoken by the great chief Crazy Horse. He said that the time would come when the eagle and the raven would nest together, when those who had been enemies would find common ground in their love for the earth and their children. Grandmother Sage reached into a medicine bundle at her waist and withdrew something that made Clara's breath catch a single white eagle feather, its surface marked with intricate red and black designs that seemed to shift and dance in the firelight. This feather, the old woman continued, has been waiting for more than 20 years to find its proper owner. It was given to me in a vision, along with the knowledge that someday a white woman would come to us not as conqueror or missionary, but as one seeking to become what she was meant to be. The elder approached Clara slowly, each step deliberate and ceremonial. When she reached arm's length, she paused and fixed Clara with a stare that seemed to look straight through to her soul. "Do you understand what you are asking for?" Grandmother Sage asked. "To be adopted into the Lakota nation is not simply to change your name or your clothes. It is to accept responsibility for our children, our elders, our sacred places. It is to pledge your life to the continuation of our people, even when that pledge might cost you everything you hold dear." Clara met the old woman's gaze steadily. "I understand, Grandmother. I have already lost everything I thought I valued, and in losing it, I found what truly matters. I ask not to be given something I haven't earned, but to be recognized for what I have already become in my heart." Grandmother Sage nodded slowly, then began to sing in the old language words, so ancient that even many of the Lakota present couldn't understand their literal meaning, though everyone felt their power. As she sang, she fastened the white eagle feather into Clara's hair, the sacred plumes settling against her temple like a benediction. "From this day forward," Thunderhorse announced, "you are no longer a stranger among us. You are daughter, sister, mother to our people. Your blood is our blood. Your children will be our children. Your fate is bound to ours until the end of time." The ceremony that followed was unlike anything from Clara's previous life. There were more songs, more sacred objects passed from hand to hand, more ritual words that seemed to reshape reality through their speaking. But at its heart, the ceremony was about community, about the willingness of a group of people to expand their definition of family, to include someone who had started as an outsider. As the formal adoption concluded and the celebration began, Clara found herself surrounded by well-wishers and gift-givers. Weapons, clothing, jewelry, horses. The presents came in a steady stream, each one representing acceptance from a different family or clan. But the gift that meant the most came from Red Hawk, who approached her near midnight carrying something wrapped in soft deerskin. "For my new daughter," he said gruffly, unwrapping a beautifully crafted war club whose handle was decorated with his own family symbols. "May it serve you as well as your courage served my grandson." Clara accepted the weapon with the solemnity it deserved, understanding that Red Hawk was giving her far more than a tool of war. He was offering her a place in his own family lineage, acknowledging her not just as a member of the tribe, but as someone worthy of carrying his ancestors' legacy. The celebration continued until dawn, with dancing, storytelling, and the kind of communal joy that Clara had never experienced in her previous life. But as the sun began to rise over the eastern mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, she found herself walking hand in hand with Chatan toward the small Tipi they now shared as husband and wife. "Any regrets?" Chatan asked as they paused on a hill overlooking the camp, where their people were finally beginning to settle down for some well-earned rest. Clara considered the question seriously. In the distance, she could see smoke rising from a dozen cook fires, could hear the laughter of children playing despite their exhaustion, could feel the solid warmth of the community that had claimed her as their own. But she could also remember other things: silk dresses and fancy carriages, servants who anticipated her every need, a world where survival was taken for granted and comfort was the highest aspiration. "None," she said finally, and meant it with every fiber of her being. "Even though you gave up wealth, comfort, everything your birth promised you." Clara smiled, thinking of Morrison's bone necklace and her father's willingness to trade her freedom for his debts. "I gave up a cage that looked like luxury. In return, I found something worth dying for, and, more importantly, something worth living for." As they entered their tipi and prepared for sleep, Clara reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been Clara Whitmore, a rancher's daughter whose greatest ambition was to avoid an unwanted marriage. Tonight, she was Tyankala Sonwin, adopted daughter of Thunderhorse, wife to a Lakota warrior, and keeper of traditions that stretched back countless generations. The transformation had required her to sacrifice everything she had been in order to become everything she was meant to be. It had tested her in ways she never could have imagined, forcing her to discover strengths she didn't know she possessed and face truths about herself that was sometimes painful to acknowledge. But as she lay in Chatan's arms, listening to the quiet sounds of the sleeping camp around them, Clara knew that every sacrifice had been worth it. She had found her people, her purpose, her true self. She had learned that freedom was not the absence of responsibility, but the ability to choose which responsibilities to embrace. And she had discovered that sometimes the most profound transformation comes not from adding something to your life, but from stripping away everything that isn't truly you until only the essential remains. In the distance, an eagle called from its perch high in the mountains, a wild, fierce sound that spoke of boundless skies and unlimited possibilities. Clara smiled in the darkness, recognizing a kindred spirit in that cry. She who stands with eagles had finally found her place in the world, and she would defend it with everything she had become.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.